Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday I started on this video, but I ran out of time, and there's a lot of good stuff in here. And in fact, Luke clipped the about 6.5 minutes of the Gödel. I'll be back, Gödel. Of the Gödel moment. And but there's tons of good stuff in this video, and I want to talk about it. So here we go.
Thing that, I know I'm supposed
No,
to.
not ready to go yet. And I just realized that my rough draft for Sunday, the volume's probably low on that too. So, oh well, you'll just have to tune in to Living Stones on Sunday to hear the real thing, and I'll probably post the real thing because Rick's got that sound dialed in at Living Stones. In fact, Rick has the sound. Rick and Jared have the sound dialed in so well. Forbes magazine has on the cover, Sacramento pastor claims the best church live stream per capita in the world. Well, maybe not really on Forbes cover, but yeah, Matt Croft, pretty cool AI stuff. Anyway, sound should be right now.
Do because more people will click on it. Yeah, there's something in that.
No, I appreciate everything that everyone is saying. First, on the story, I do think, to say something very broad, a role of story now is to tell story, like in 2025. Stories should focus on stories of the Gödel point, because thinking the Gödel point and the encounters of the Gödel point is the problem of global pluralism. And I think story, it is very important, like almost in a sense, the role of story is to articulate the event horizon, the edge of our current problems. In the Gödel point is, I think, the key issue, the problem of internally consistent.
And stories are really nice in there because stories are funny in that on one hand we sort of look at stories as kind of the ultimate cross-cultural thing, but they're not. The landscapers are here. Stories are themselves embedded in culture, and stories tell a lot about culture. It's funny because I go back and I think about those Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversations about stories. And Sam Harris like, no, stories.
And systems. The point on animation, yeah, like you can tell stories in animation, anime, that you can't realistically tell in live action. And here's the issue. If actually our ability to be rational is tied to the kind of stories we hear and what we believe is possible, if you are limited in the kind of stories you can tell, you'll actually have a more limited rationality and your thinking will be more limited. And then also, too, there's a strong
rationality is built upon a storied world. What do I mean by that? If you go way back in this channel, I've long talked about stories as compression engines. And that's an image because stories carry way more content, way more information than just like a string of propositions, because the string of propositions lacks a setting, and stories have this incredible way of creating a setting in which a rationality governs. Oh, here's a fun little face. Now movies play on this all the time. Sometimes the movie will start with, something from the future, and it'll be like, what sense does that make? The opening scene of The Matrix, where you have Trinity, with this motorcycle sort of coming down from heaven, and that grabs our attention because we want to know, what is the world in which this particular thing makes sense? And that sense making just assumes that the narrative and the story create the context and the world in which rationality lives. Rationality only lives within that world. Now, we're going to get talking about closed systems with the Gödel point.
Strong relationship between music, like what music is composed and what stories are in the society, right? Like, why does Bach make St. Matthew's Passion? Because there's the story of Christianity, right? And so I would argue that some of the greatest music that's been made in the last 30 years has been like Joe Hisaishi out of the Mizuzaki films. It's been Yubaku in like Final Fantasy VI or whatever, because these stories in these video games and these animes gave them reason to make music that they otherwise would never have reason to make.
Yeah.
In other words, that the the world sort of comes, we see the art, and again, many of these things have like edges to them, and so you get a glimpse of it, and you get enough of a glimpse that you want a little bit more of it. And then it's also the case that often through the art, the rest of the story begins to make sense. We can often go both ways, especially because the world is and has been for a very long time deeply networked together on various different levels.
And that results in there being these extraordinary pieces, like the opening of Mononoke, or Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind. Like, this music is unbelievable, right? But this is also the point, is that you should actually expect a loss of quality, and I'd have to justify all this. You should expect a loss of quality in all the arts in a society where story is in decline. And the argument would be that where you are limited in the kind of stories you can make, it's simply probability that you will probably have a decline of story, especially when you start getting into more of the deep philosophical problems like the Gödel point, et cetera, and so forth, because it's very difficult.
And it's interesting when you talk about something, as this gets to the difficulty of estimation, the difficulty of summation. Sherry actually just sent me a video that said, no, actually, we could be on the edge of a new renaissance. I haven't watched the whole video yet because I don't get a lot of chance during the day to watch videos during the day. I'm usually getting work done, and I take little breaks during the day, and I'll watch a little bit of a video, and then I'll get back to work and this kind of thing. But it's interesting how we have a sense that, well, let's say Hollywood, we have a sense that Hollywood has lost its way. There are a lot of videos about that. And we sort of look back at other periods of time and say, no, those stories sort of propelled, and we have a drought of stories. And even let's say the big stories of not too long ago, that's something like Game of Thrones, have sort of petered out, and they're not as living or as vibrant as Lord of the Rings. And I just again watched Lord of the Rings this holiday season, and that movie is now, those movies are over 20 years old, and they're good. They're really good. And I was watching others watch them. And I was mentioning to someone that, I watched this Galaxy, this movie, this documentary about the making of Galaxy Quest, and it gives you a little insight into how movies are made, and it gets to the point of saying it's amazing anything coherent gets made at all. So, but yeah, we have a sense of story and how it works
to figure out how to tell that story. It may just be the case that the story you think of that doesn't work very well in live action. Well, if you don't have animation, then you can't tell that story then. And your society might be worse off because you don't have that story.
And this made me think about the relationship between dreams and story. I did a Substack a couple weeks ago. I really got to get leaning into I need a rhythm of writing Substacks, and this week just disrupted all my rhythms. But the holidays, and then this week. Where was I going with this?
Would actually argue I would argue a lot of the Japanese works have been dealing with the problem of internally consistent systems, certainly over the last 10 years in different ways, that they were allowed to because of the medium of animation. Now, all of this has to be expanded on, but
Daniel, I wanted to...
Oh, and of course, animation is a language of media. And yeah, some of that really good, I love how he put it there. So I forget the guy's name, but he does these amazing animated movies that, my daughters would say, oh, we've got to watch this. And they'd ask for the DVDs for Christmas and things like this. And they're interesting. Oh yeah, I remember what I was going to say. They're like dreamlike. I woke up this morning and thinking about dreams because of what I had dreamt before. And a lot of the dreams that I had were were very easily explainable because they were just sort of expressions of anxiety. But dreams are a palette that are broader than most of the palette. And so I really liked what he talked about in terms of the different, anime, in terms of you can tell a different story with the animation as opposed to, let's say, all of the CGI and the green screens that they tend to be doing now. That's a different mashup.
Please.
I'm being a little actually conscious of the viewer right now, but would you actually just say for someone who doesn't know, what's the Gödel point? What's an internally consistent system? These are key ideas for you. We've talked many times, but it might be nice to just pop them in here.
Absolutely. The problem of internally consistent systems is the problem that people at this point in history, let's say you have Christianity, atheism, Islam, and we'll just take those three. I would argue that all three of them are internally consistent, meaning if you assume their first premises, then there is no essential contradiction in the belief system. Like, it all goes together. And yet all three of those are internally consistent. Well, then...
Okay, so someone left a really good comment in the video that I released this morning about, okay, well, that's a mathematical system. And now we're sort of using this. It's interesting, the psychology even behind the employment of this system as an analogy to help us see these other systems. Now, I'm compelled by his point, and I think I think it's a really helpful point. But I should be sobered by the fact that, number one, I don't really understand the mathematical system itself. Number two, this kind of authority, that there's a certain kind of authority that this analogy borrows from in order to complete itself. And again, none of this is saying it's wrong, because I think actually this analogy is very helpful. And I really like the way he sets it up, because he sets it up in a way that's similar to, let's say, Calvinist presuppositionalism, which is what I'm most familiar with. And it's the questions about presupposition and presuppositionalism has been a tool that my own little Christian tradition has used. So let's have him walk this out for us.
What do? I would argue that all three of them are internally consistent, meaning if you assume their first premises, then there is no essential contradiction in the belief system. Like, it all goes together. And yet all three of those are internally consistent. Well, then what do? How does democracy work then? Because the whole idea of democracy is there's the possibility of convincing people to change their views, or we can have an exchange of ideas and people will shift. Well, that only can be the case, at least as traditionally understood, if there are no internally consistent systems, only if there's one internally consistent system, ergo the rational one, And if there's actually multiple internally consistent systems, then we have to rethink what exactly democracy is. We have to rethink what it is when we talk, because it basically means you can't convince people out of an internally consistent system or to change their views with rationality, because rationality is folded. It's folded into it, right? Like,
now this, what he's basically mapped out here is an undoing of how, let's say, under New Atheism, they imagined the world works. So here you have truth and, let's say, scientific truth. Somebody also recommended a book to me, Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, and I started that. I have a little tradition that I do on Fridays. I usually do it after the live stream, but even though I didn't do the live stream today, I still did the little tradition, and so I started listening to it, and there were some paragraphs that caught my attention. In its liberal idealism, the 19th century was honestly convinced that it was on the straight and unfailing path towards being the best of all worlds. Earlier eras with their wars, famines, and revolts were deprecated as times when mankind was still immature and unenlightened. But now it was merely a matter of decades until the last vestige of evil and violence would finally be conquered, and this faith in an uninterrupted and irresistible progress truly had the force of a religion for that generation. One began to believe more in this progress than in the Bible, and its gospel appeared ultimate because of the daily new wonders of science and technology. In fact, at the end of this peaceful century, a general advance became more marked, more rapid, more varied. At night, the dim street lights of former times were replaced by electric lights. The shops spread their tempting glow of the main streets out to the city limits. Thanks to the telephone, one could talk at a distance from person to person. People moved about in horseless carriages with a new rapidity. They soared aloft. The dream of Icarus was fulfilled. Comfort made its way from the houses of the fashionable to those of the middle class. It was no longer necessary to fetch water from the pump or the hallway, or to have the trouble to build a fire in the fireplace. Hygiene spread and filth disappeared. People became handsomer, stronger, healthier as sport steeled their bodies. Fewer cripples and maimed and persons with goiters were seen on the streets, and all of these miracles were accomplished by science, the archangel of progress. Progress was also made in social matters. Year after year, new rights were accorded to the individual. Justice was administered more benignly and humanely. And even the problem of problems, the poverty of great masses, no longer seemed insurmountable. The right to vote was being accorded to wider circles, and with it the possibility of legally protecting their interests. Sociologists and professors competed with one another to create healthier and happier living conditions for the proletariat. Small wonder, then, that this century sunned itself in its own accomplishments and turned upon each completed decade as the prelude of a better one. There was as little belief in the possibility of such barbaric declines as wars between the peoples of Europe as there was in witches and ghosts. Our fathers were comfortably saturated with the confidence in the unfailing and binding power of tolerance and conciliation. They honestly believed that the divergencies and the boundaries between nations and sects would gradually melt away into a common humanity, and that peace and security, the highest of treasures, would be shared by all mankind. I watched some of this little clip of an upcoming conversation with Rhett McLaughlin and Alex O'Connor. And what's amazing about this is Rhett, who has given up belief in Christianity, is trying to once again preach to his old flock and congregation and tell them, I think in some ways, go back to the beginning of the 19th century, of the 20th century, when people really believed in all of this stuff. And on one hand, he wants to put away that silly Bronze Age book. But then he keeps referring to it, and he basically says, you're being inconsistent with who you are. And, well, fair enough. But it's just such an interesting contrast, because this religion of progress, which this Austrian Jew who watched the whole thing just catastrophically come apart in Europe in the Second World War, says this was our religion. This is what we believed. It was unquestioning. That was just the way it was, and science and rationality would bring us there. And it's amazing that religion continues to continue.
Because it basically means you can't convince people out of an internally consistent system or to change their views with rationality, because rationality is folded. It's folded into it, right? Like they have their system. And I think we see this honestly.
Rationality is a function of the system. Again, it's imagined by, ostensibly new atheists that somehow rationality sort of comes down from heaven. But O.G. Rose is saying there, what Daniel's saying there is basically, no, your rationality is a function of the overall system. If you believe these certain things within your system, you're going to act a certain way because that's what's reasonable in the system. It's the basic assumption of presuppositionalism, that the reason is within the system. But now when we have a world where we have these complete systems bumping into each other, what do? You don't want to have what happened in the first half of the 20th century, where Europe rips itself apart, even though all of its systems, and this is where this is interesting, because the systems always have fuzzy edges, because we're never completely captive to one system. And, part of what the exercise with the twins in, divided by Donald Trump is the other systems also begin to differentiate and split, and then certain systems have common code. So one could say the Abrahamic religions has a degree of common code within these so that the systems can at least talk together. But then part of what develops is that as the differentiation occurs, the walls develop to sort of separate them, and you have these other complete systems that begin to generate.
It's like people's stories and their marriages, their traumas. Everyone has an internally consistent system that they're stuck in.
This is the root of it all. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would argue that actually manifests on the worldview stage. The same goes with things like communism, Christianity, liberalism, free market. I would argue Austrian economics is an internally consistent system if you accept the base axioms. I would argue communism is an internally consistent system if you accept the base axiom, right? Now, the key I'm saying is the base axiom, right? The issue is after Gödel, it was the end of the possibility of a formal system. And what that means is a system that doesn't have to refer to anything outside of itself. So the dream of, you could say, like everything before Gödel, was to have an internally consistent system that would not have to rely on anything that could not be provided by that internal system in its very consistency, right?
Now, if you listen to Sam Harris, you can hear this dream whispered. And of course, the God of this dream is rationality. And the boundaries of this dream are, well, at the edge of rationality, then there's the place that you can go with medication and psychedelics where none of this matters. But here on Earth, rationality reigns.
Another way to look at it is like the trade-off between coherence and correspondence that we'll talk about a lot. Like if your map is completely perfect, like it totally coheres, then by definition it can't be the same as the territory. Because if it was, then it would be as big and massive as the territory, and you couldn't use it, right?
So that's a resolution problem, a fractal problem, a compressive problem. There's basically no such thing as lossless compression because of combinatorial explosiveness, because everything just keeps, the further down you go, the more complex things become.
Like a map that was a perfect map would be useless. It would be the territory, right? So if your map is completely coherent and makes sense to you as a map, and you can actually use it to navigate the territory, then that means it can't be the territory. So that's weird, right? That's weird. The dream of a formal system was that if you made a perfect map, it would be the territory. That a perfect map would be equivalent to the territory, okay? It's not. You always have an excess. You always have information you lose. You cannot get the rules justifying the system within the system itself, right? And so that's the incompleteness. That's the Gödel incompleteness that makes you realize the map is not the territory.
And hear that again. You cannot get the rules justifying the system within the system itself. And once you sort of get your mind around that, this Gödel point begins to make more sense because we run into them. Now, part of what I was contemplating on Wednesday, so Wednesday I had to get up early, had to finish up the eulogy, had to drive down to Ripon, do the graveside committal service for the woman of this church. They had family roots down in Ripon, the cemetery in Ripon, drive back up here to Sacramento, bring in the flowers. And so it was a busy day, but it was a day I had contemplation. I was thinking about this video. I listened to this video on the way down to Ripon, and I was thinking about how death functions within our systems and why we're seeing the dynamic of de-churching and deconstruction, and because these systems are bumping up against themselves, and it's not just. See, on one hand, I want to say that from some within a system, of course, the departure of others from that system is a cause of grief and loss. Now, those who are, Tim Keller basically would look at things and say, well, you're you're not really losing a system, you're really exchanging systems. And I think that's a better way to imagine it. You're traveling from one system to another. Now, although these systems might have their own world of logic within them, none of us are purists in any system. As products of a deeply pluralist age, we've all got influence from these other systems, and we use these probably smaller portions of the system to make life work, but then we've got some borrowed code from other systems, and it's a tremendously messy situation. And so what we'll see is someone will trade one system for another. And a part of this then is, as we watch a person, say, leave a system and join another system, and we look at the translation, then we begin to also say, okay, well, I can see why that person made that and changed that system, because a lot of what we're doing is also looking at certain evaluative points in our lives. Are they getting healthier or sicker? And you can sort of dead reckon that. Are they getting happier or sadder? Do their relationships look like they have better quality or lesser quality? Now, the difficulty with all of these evaluations is that they are also framed within a story, and they are also framed within a time scale. And often you'll see that the short term and the long term look very different. Not only within the system, but even sometimes possibly between systems, to the degree that we can evaluate between them, because of course our evaluations are always products of the dominant systems in which we are enclosed, even as we're sort of looking through the semi-permeable wall at people living in other systems and trying to understand it, trying to be intelligible, even though, of course, as we've said many times and seen in a lot of examples, even our view of another system from within our system is of course, it's impacted by that view. There are insides and outsides, and you can only know something to a degree from the outside, and you know it better from the inside, but in other ways worse. I mean, it's just all of these trade-offs.
So this is the double move. There's the weird double move. The fact that the map is not the territory, and that's the language I tend to use from Korbisky because it's the easiest to kind of get at it. Now, Kurt Gödel does it in formal logic. I mean, he does it in a much more extraordinary manner. And he uses something called Gödel numbers to actually show that this would be the case, he's thinking Frege and obviously Russell and Whitehead and people. But the funny move is that the very fact that the map is not the territory means that you have the problem of dealing with the possibility of confusing their map as the territory and choosing X map versus Y map. Because if no map is perfect, then I can't, from the very imperfection of a map, determine which map should be used and which should be disregarded, right? Like, I can't go, well, Christianity, hey, that's just a map, it's not the territory. Well, I can turn around and say, well, hey, Islam, communism, that's just a map, it's not the territory. So the fact that maps are not the territory can't be used to get people to change their minds. In fact, it can be used to make people just keep whatever views they have. Because if no map is the territory, and this map is internally consistent, it's as good as any other map. So why would I change? Why would I change?
And this is a move that I've pulled often. And I remember, especially at a certain point in the trajectory of this channel and the trajectory of the conversations. And this is a move that, Rafe Kelly really noticed me pulling, because if you look at someone like Rhett and his argument for, I just think it's tremendously inconsistent for these Christians to seek and wield political power within their identity as Christians. Oh, okay. So they're being inconsistent. So they're citizens of the nation, just like you. They can have political aspirations and vote for the candidate that they wish, just like you. Is the reason that you're annoyed with them because they're beating you at that game and you think they shouldn't play it? So you're picking up this Bible that you've rejected to try to discourage them from beating you at the game that they're beating you at. Why do you care about the game? Because if it's just a game, why care? Why can't they play? And that gets into this dynamic of, okay, well, maybe maybe we can't know the truth. Maybe we are just subject. Well, then what's to prevent me from getting what I want? Now, you might want a whole certain world, but I might want a different world. So it's just me against you. But he says, no, no, no. My world is about kindness and goodness and light and power and openness, because those things are true. And it's like, well, you're within your own system here. Okay. And again, I would say, I'm glad you're in that system, because I think that system is basically sort of a deracinated Christian system. And so I'm glad that Christianity has had the power over your imagination, even to the degree that it has now convinced you that these things are just true, and they're not made true, and they're not even that their authority comes from someone who claimed to be the Son of God and claims to sit at the right hand of God the Father on high and reigns over history and will come back with his kingdom to finally complete this kingdom that he begins. Now, you don't believe in any of that stuff, but there's a quality of that that you continue to embrace. Well, I'm happy. I'm happy. But why are you bothering the Christians? Why are you bothering the people that still believe that book? You seem to be bothering them because they're beating you at the game that you desperately want to play. And if they just would go back to saying, oh, I'm just going to sit and praise God in my little church and wait for the second coming or my death so that I can go to heaven and there I'll be happy all the day, you'd kind of want them to return to that sort of quietism, even though you also want them to abandon it because it's not true. And so if they abandon it and because it's not true, what then will they do? Will they then enter politics? I mean, it just, I watch him do this and I just think, dude, are you not self-aware at all of the deep ironies of the game that you're playing? And I don't say that to sort of oppose him politically, because it would probably be that our politics aren't that far apart. But why would you, let's imagine that you're anyway, back to the other, this stuff, this stuff gets me triggered, and I know you guys like to watch that, but I don't always care to do it for the sake of my soul.
Right? So the very fact that the map is not the territory actually gives you reason to never change your map, right? But in the very same move that makes all maps equal, that it must do so by meaning that the map isn't the territory, that there is a point of a realization of incompleteness, right? And that's the Gödel point. So the tricky double move is that the Gödel point, which unveils incompleteness, can either be used to keep you in your map forever, because there's never any reason to change, or it could be used as the meeting ground between people encountering one another to then give you a way to address global pluralism. Because that's the tricky double move, is that I could use the Gödel point to finalize my map and make it indestructible. I could use the Gödel point to make my map indestructible, because I can say, absolutely, my map is not the territory, but neither is you, and there is nothing you can say to make me change my map, and now it's indestructible. And that's basically what people will do in their ego. They'll use the indestructible, and they'll choose the indestructibility. The remarkable move that I think has to be done is, instead of using the Gödel point for indestructibility, which is the ultimate temptation of the ego. I mean, you're offering indestructibility. What more could the ego ever want? It's incredibly rational to use the Gödel point for indestructibility. No, but what we're saying is what must be done for global pluralism is that people make the non-rational move of using the Gödel point as a point of connection with other people. That is where the maps encounter. But that is a massive ego death move.
And I think when he's talking there, that is in many ways, to a degree, what the conversations we have online aspire to do. This is from Matt C's great little video.
And all kinds of truth and non-truth. And a lot of those people are probably sociopaths. They probably have political amounts of political inabilities to sympathize with people, because their root systems are exposed. because they're actually growing their roots in space instead of in soil. Okay, that's a fundamental dysfunction of roots, is if you can see the roots, if the roots are out of the soil. And the internet's trying to convince you that you should expose your roots, and you shouldn't. So that my friends, that is why TLC is uniquely good. And that's why I'm never gonna convince any of you to become a Calvinist or a Unitarian or a Universalist, because your root systems are exposed. Because I'm just enjoying the sweet smelling produce of what's happening beneath the soil offline is really what's happening. And we might all be thrusting each other's our own flowery presences into each other's lives kind of virtually. And I celebrate that. I think it's one of the beautiful things about what's happening here. And perhaps for some of us, see, now I'm going to break my own rule and say nobody's ever going to convince anybody of anything. But people might be having to renegotiate fundamental beliefs about why, if person X, isn't a Christian, then why is he my internet friend? Right? And maybe they thought they couldn't be friends with anyone who didn't have certain beliefs, or they were raised to think that, and now they're having to renegotiate that. And maybe they're struggling with, do I need to find a different denomination that allows me to have internet friends that could explain why, person over here has very different flowers and very different leaves for me, and is just as beautiful as I am, right? Maybe he spells even better than I do. Here's a plug for Calvinism. There's a rich Reformed tradition explaining how people can be made the image of God and not ascribe to your set of propositional beliefs. But I happen to know this is another Reformed tradition that is not only the Reformed tradition that has this, and that believes that, and I happen to know there's a strain within the Ortho tradition that says this too. It's certainly the case post-Vatican II in the Catholic tradition that they say this. So nobody has an excuse to stay right where they're at, frankly. Sorry, nobody has the excuse to.
And so earlier in the video, he talked about people come into this space, and Luke is trying to make us a Universalist, and Sam is trying to make us a Unitarian, and others have given up their belief, and others are Catholic, and we're just all over here, and we're in some ways all in these formal systems, but we're also figuring out how to come together and have conversations. And it isn't that none of us are evaluating the different formal systems as options for our lives. It is that we are in some ways continuing to develop our own systems to appreciate what other systems have.
Massive ego death move. And it's incredibly non-rational, but it's basically what is completely necessary today. I'll pause and ask if that and I'm happy to elaborate on anything.
Can I just say there too, like, as you're mapping that out, you've mapped that out so many times now for me, and that I've heard, and I've always heard the parallel with the intrapsychic in it. That was just the clearest yet. Like, in terms of like everything you were describing there, we could just talk about someone turning up for therapy, what's going on, why they're trapped, why they're so trapped. The majority of people I see are like really intelligent, hardworking. These are people that if you could just think your way out of this, they would have thought their way out of this by now. And they are just stuck in this hell of knowing something's not quite right and they cannot figure it out. Anyway, and the Gödel point in that, I mean, and the work I do, the way I see it, is that is the portal into the unconscious. Do you want to allow that to come up and take it seriously? Do you want to go, as Seth said, fishing? I thought that was good actually in this regard, because like the water represents the unconscious. Do you want to actually look at what's down there and bring it up and actually add it in and make something? Do you want to take it seriously? Or is your life going to be in service of ensuring that that you keep that at a distance? Actually, it's really important I stay on this map for, like, I'm not using it correctly, but for that reason, to actually avoid taking the Gödel point seriously. And I see now as well, I mean, I just like that that's linked to the non-rational move, because I think actually it was our very first conversation, Daniel, when that rigor of mystery one, and that term's returned to my mind in recent weeks. And I'd actually wanted to talk to both of you about it today. So here we are. Look at that. How did I get there? What was I talking about? I was talking about there's the whole, and then
the psychological connection with the
yeah. Thank you.
Point. Yeah.
Thank you, friends. The first conversation that we had, Daniel, when I was trying to explain, it was like my first attempts to try and explain. There was something I'd always heard you at Voicecraft talking about non-rationality. For some reason, I was like, but that is like the thing that we're asking people to do in my kind of therapy, is make that non-rational move. Way more than I think in other forms of psychotherapy I've trained in, and I've trained in lots. Because I was looking for this.
Now, a common temptation for people to imagine is, again, sort of there's this image that people are in silos or dark buildings or caves, and then this move into non-rationality or irrationality or the subconscious, that's always a move out of the cave into the bright sunshine and the truth of day. Not exactly, because all of these formal systems are themselves inheritances of other formal systems. It's not that you can live without a formal system. You need a worldview, and even if you're somehow trying to construct something that you believe is completely open and limitless and absolutely free, those kinds of things then become the axioms within that system. There is always a system. There is always a worldview. There is always something that you are inhabiting. But all of our formal systems are themselves products of the Gödel point. And one might say, you know, I got into a debate about the Trinity with Sam. It wasn't video recorded. It was in a private system, closed, and something that I actually avoid, because I have various reasons for avoiding it. But I mean, part of my point to him was that in many ways, for the people who saw Jesus was the Gödel point of their closed system. And for some people, he completely destroys that, and a new world is created. And so, in fact, we pass through these points and new worlds are created. And part of the, let me get to some of the language that he used. The Gödel point is the necessary vulnerability of being. And so when confronted with Jesus, the disciples, Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, had to embrace a vulnerability, had to embrace something that would shatter a system they were living in. Now, the pieces of that system inevitably come back together there'll be some consistency and some continuity with the old system, but there will be rearrangements. And you can see that if you, say, read carefully about Paul of Tarsus, or really anyone who's made any kind of transformation in their life from one worldview to another, from one construction to another. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always necessarily moving from a worse system to a better system. Sometimes people make bad exchanges. And again, this scales up to whole communities. But it's what this analogy, and then I really like how he connects it with entropy versus negentropy, where in negentropy there's going to continually be growth and development, and that's sort of built into, let's say, Christian theology in a way, because whereas justification in some ways, let's say in a Reformed systematics, justification in some ways is sort of this Gödel point of this transformation into something else. In sanctification, there are ongoing transformations ahead, where there will be a breaking and a reconstructing, and a breaking and a reconstructing. And the reason you do this is because, again, the map is not a territory, and as you go through life, you want to continue to refine those maps. You inherit these first drafts from your parents, and you continue to, things have to break apart and come back together, and break apart and come back together. You see that with, let's say, Peter. I preached about John 1. Peter meets Jesus. Jesus says, yeah, you're going to get a new name. And in the sermon, I think that's the sermon I preached last week. I think I'll post it this Sunday morning, the Sunday version to the whole channel. If you're really curious, you can find it on the Living Stones website. It might not be clipped out of the service though, because Chemo's taking a week off. But Peter is going to go through these significant transformations, and will continue to do so, as will Paul. And of course, the confrontation that happens in the book of Galatians between Peter and Paul, where Paul confronts Peter. These are all these things that happen, but it's because you both need formalized systems, and that's what we're going to have more conversation about. Institutions are fundamentally formalized systems, but we need that so we can cohabitate, so that we can understand each other, so that we can work productively together. But there will continue to be breakdown of them, and new ones formed. And again, progress assumes they will always go in one direction towards betterment. Not always, but there's almost always adaptations, and there are usually trade-offs with these adaptations.
There is actually there is a way in which we are able to help a person, to assist a person to make that, I guess, non-rational move, to actually go and I know I'm kind of butchering your very beautiful explanation here of maps and Gödel points, and but I just I really felt it there. That is exactly what we are doing in this kind of therapy. And we do that too. Actually, this is a link to what you were just saying about the link between story and animation. We do that because we allow a person to be able to get in contact with things happening in their body and play with them in imagination, essentially. There's a bit more to it. They have to be really emotionally activated, and which means often very anxious. But once you can do that, then you can see what that emotion is trying to let you see in imagination. That space is so important to all of this, because it's the bit that's like, I don't actually have to go and do it in reality, but I can finally allow myself to see that it lives in there. The impulse to do it lives in there. And through you can experience like you did it that way as well, which then flows on to other emotions you would have about having really done that in real life, which is often part of what's trapped. Doing that process is the thing that essentially sounds like what you're talking about for an individual. I see this territory in you, or I see something new about it. Or more so, I see almost the errors I was making, or I see the ways I was oversimplifying, or I see I don't know, there's something about it. It just reconfigures what is possible. Sorry, I probably just butchered all of that. But yeah, I want to highlight that, because it sounds like what we're talking about in terms of global pluralism is, once again, I always see it through, well, this is what we're doing in a person. And if you can do that in a person, then you can do it in relationship, and that transforms relationships. And then the scale grows. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's I want to try to connect some dots because I think this is really good. I mean, yes, there is the experience of this is my religion and it explains the world to me this way, and you have that religion and how.
You had the perfect still face. You had the perfect still face.
No,
the algorithm's gonna love it.
I want to see. Oh, it still says recording.
We waited. We didn't talk about it. We talked about a thunderstorm
Until I saw that you were still, but
yeah.
I
no.
can remember.
We did that. Maybe help as well. But we'll just...
There's several layers, there's several perspectives on the Gödel point. So there could be, that I have my religious worldview, my political worldview, but it could also be like within a family setting that the husband sees it one way, the wife sees it the other way, and we just can't see each other's, points of view on some level. But then, as we were saying earlier in the call, and I think the work of O.G. Rose is all about this, but we're also speaking about anime, or I think it's also what we're trying to do just in these conversations is you can sort of say, hey, there's a thing called the Gödel point, and here's how it shows up, and you can help people recognize it. And then I was also, so again, to just sort of, I want to connect a bunch of dots, but this idea of the algorithm as compared to fishing, right? To fish, and you were noting the symbol of the unconscious, but it's also just like, I don't know if there's any fish down there. I'm hungry. I hope I'll get one. I want something for dinner, and then yeah.
My way of thinking is there are definitely fish down there. It would be weird if there weren't, but I have no idea if I'm going to get one.
Yeah.
Right. And there's definitely people watching YouTube, but I have no idea if they're going to watch my video and click the link and do what I want them to do after they click the link, and all of that. But it strikes me that even the algorithm itself is fundamentally lodged inside the Gödel point in this day and age. So we talked before about, do you cater to the algorithm or not? But the fact is, everyone has to figure that out. Everyone's doing it differently. There are certain, if you're some top executive at one of these companies, you have a little more idea of how the algorithm works than other people. But we also know about the viral videos that know, and how did that go viral? Like, it is this kind of common, flashpoints. And I think, so something I was thinking about before the call, and I'll introduce it now, but is our notions of life after death, or our notions of, our religious notions about God or whatever. But all of those notions are some notion we have about a thing we can't prove. I mean, we can have faith, we can be super convinced, but yeah, so what I've been thinking about in particular is also that whatever view we hold of interaction with that which I cannot actually fully understand, there's still different specific strategies for doing that, right? So, when I was an atheist, it's like you die and everything goes black, and that's it. That's a different way of being in your body. That's a different way of determining how much capacity I have to handle a situation that feels a little risky, versus, I believe in God, I believe in heaven, I believe in reincarnation, I believe that I have multiple lives, and, I can slowly learn the lessons. I believe that there's someone looking out for me.
Yes.
And that too is, so the way I like to think of it now is like, if someone made a movie, and called it like The Map Is Not the Territory, The Revenge of the Gödel Point,
great movie,
Final Fantasy #3 or whatever. But like, what scene of that movie am I in right now? Can I be with a person and be like, I can't really penetrate under the surface of who they are because that's beyond the veil. But can I make guesses about what's beyond the veil? And I just feel like the algorithm is a version of the veil I guess if I could boil everything I'm saying into this one word, I really want to highlight the idea of the veil. I can't see through it, but I know there's something on the other side, and I feel that that's a certain level of awareness within the current, just the current situation, and that Daniel and Michelle have described in that way of the map is not the territory.
Well, first off, I think it is absolutely the case that the Gödel point, the problem of internally consistence, is fractal in the sense of, on the level of the individual, it is a fractal of on the worldview, and it's all isomorphic. It's all coherent. It's all the same, just in different accidents, if you will. But structurally, it's identical. I would argue that the Gestalt of being itself is a Gödel Gestalt, meaning it is a whole with a Gödel point. But that Gödel point, if you approach it correctly, is the source of negentropy. But if you use the Gödel point instead to avoid the Gödel point, it's entropy. It's equilibrium and death. So your choice of how you relate to the Gödel point is basically the choice of life or death, the choice of entropy or negentropy. And at this point in history, as the Gödel point, in my opinion, is becoming more and more visible and vivid, then the absolute choice is becoming more and more unavoidable. And by absolute choice, I mean basically how you choose to relate to the Gödel point. Do you choose to dwell in it or to use it to make yourself indestructible? That is becoming like, that decision is now becoming clear at this moment of history. And it defines every level of the stack, from the personal to the worldview, actually. And it's the choice of entropy or negentropy, the life or death, right? But one of the reasons we choose to use the Gödel point to be invincible, because isn't invincibility life? Isn't that to choose life? Isn't it to choose the Gödel point death? The great conspiracy. It's the exact opposite. Choosing the Gödel point is life, and choosing the Gödel point for indestructibility is death, actually. But on the face of it, rationally, you would associate indestructibility.
And I think about, at least in the Lord of the Rings movie, the question that Arwen has to face in terms of staying with Aragorn or going with the elves into the sea. Now, going to the elves into the sea seems like invincibility, because go to the undying land along with your people, or you stay here and you die, but there's a child, and you can see how these moments become ironic hinges that you think, well, this seems to bring life. It immediately, when he was describing this, I thought of Jesus' term, those who wish to save their life will lose it, and those who wish to lose it for my sake will find it. And, there Jesus gives you this paradox and says, invincibility is not actually the path to life. That's actually the path, we can use his word, to entropy.
Being right with life and survival. But the truth is the non-rational. The true isn't the rational. The true is that actually giving up indestructibility is how you live. Because once you give up indestructibility, you gain flexibility, dance, life, insight versus rationality, or the Zwingli. You gain all of these things, authentic resonance, and you find life in that, right? So what's basically happening is, at this moment in history, is a certain alignment of the personal and the worldview. It's all kind of, the fractal of it all is becoming vivid. And what you learn on the personal level is actually what you need to employ on the worldview level. And it all kind of goes up and down. I actually strongly agree that the algorithm actually provides, oddly, a potentially universal experience that is participating in the kind of Gödel point problem in an indirect way, in the same way that AI does. AI, as talked about in Belonging in 2.2, actually functions as a causer, to allude to Luber and Alex's work of the story, because it forces you to actually ask the question, what is the human being? Like, what is human? Well, funny enough, you're going to arrive at a Gödel point if you ask that question. Because here's another way to put it. Imagine a world where everything AI does, there's nothing that human beings do that AI can't also do. At that point, you either have to choose that what makes us human is lacking, therefore it is in a Gödel point, it is something that is presently absent, or lack is not nothing, and there's no difference between the human and AI. And that's the choice of self-effacement. Right? But if you actually say, no, a human being is not reducible to their internal consistency and what the AI can emulate, that there's actually something more beyond that, that's going to change everything. So AI forces this causer. Now, that has to be elaborated on, but the algorithm kind of does as well. Because, like, for me, like what you were talking about, Aspacy, on this idea that the image has a certain honesty to it. The way I think about it is that if you put up a still image, the honesty is in the sense of you don't know what you're going to get. Like, there's a certain sort of you have to want something unexpected.
Yes.
Because in a weird way, here's the funny thing: the freeze face. The reason you click it is because you're like, "Whoa, there's a surprise here." But actually, once that's gamified, it's no longer a surprise.
Yeah.
It's actually, that's the weird thing. It's actually part of the internal consistency of the algorithm. The supposed Gödel, the supposed surprise, the supposed thing that is beyond mere clickbait. Because that's the weird thing. The ultimate clickbait is something that says, no, this is serious. It's not clickbait. That's the ultimate clickbait, right? Well, that's using the Gödel point for the algorithm, as opposed to kind of, that's a gamification, right? You're using this thing that's supposed to transcend clickbait because it's serious for the ultimate clickbait. So it has a kind of ultimate deceit to it, precisely because it is trying to to present itself as not deceit at all. It's beyond it, right? But really, what you get is the expected. It's very expected. Those videos have a certain, you expect what they're going to say in the title, in the video. You have a sense of where they're going to go.
Oh, yeah.
Right? With a still image, there's a certain sort of, at least for me, if you're the kind of person that's willing to click on a photograph of Japan or just an aesthetic image, then there's a higher probability that you're the kind of person that would actually kind of align and resonate with the kind of stuff we talk about. Because you've already made a kind of non-rational choice. You've already made a choice that is not really rational or not really makes sense. Why would you click that video? It doesn't have any pull. It has no hook. So the fact that you did already kind of self-selects and suggests that you're a kind of person of whom would actually resonate with this kind of thing, right? Now, again, I mean, the OG Rose conversations have the same image of Jocko or Seth, or y'all, like the pictures and different things, right? I mean, I'm not saying pictures of people are not there, but there's also a certain predictability. It's the same sort of, basically it gives you a feeling of, this is the structure. This is the thing that we do on Friday, right? That we have this conversation. Also, there's something to be said that Michelle and I also talk about this as well. And this is why also we don't moralize things, is the way that we do things on the channel is a mixture of, if a person, the way the video is presented strongly increases the probability that that the person who clicks it would be the kind of person who resonates with the material. Right. So there's a sort of selection mechanism in that, but also from simply practical what is actually sustainable? Like, what is actually sustainable? A still image using a similar OG Rose conversation cover. This is also sustainable, which it makes Michelle and I want to continue doing it and believing in it. And so then you manage to continue doing it as well. So there's also a practical reason to it as well. So similarly, if people are using different cover pictures that might be more algorithmically, approving or something, well, that may be what they've, in their practical situation, determined needs to be done for them to sustain it, because maybe they, as a couple or as a family, wouldn't.
You get to the point where you begin to say ontology is its own justification. These inflections, these trapdoors, these turning points, these corners at these Gödel points are then sets new things in motion, sets new systems in order, sets new institutions in play, and new worlds come. And so you have this creation and destruction and creation and destruction, and off it goes. Okay, before I promised I wanted to get back to this talk about fundamentalism, because I think if you understand what he does with the Gödel point, you can begin to understand how his definition of fundamentalism works.
Art and Luke, thank you for what you're doing, and everyone, and Jeff, so appreciate it very, very, very much. No, I think that topic of fundamentalism, and Luke, I enjoyed speaking with you the other day, so wonderful to see you again. I think that topic of fundamentalism and what exactly is going on is quite interesting. And I think it also relates. I'm always very interested by this relation of personal knowledge, abstract ideas, relationship, information. I know you speak about that very often, Luke. And I think actually it's very important to get a sense of that relationship, or there can be various problems that can arise, sort of nervousness about talking about ideas. Are we doing it too much? Maybe we need to be more personal, and you get confused, and then you can just be tired by the anxiety and have a strong reaction against it, and then start tearing apart things that have been built that are actually very important. I think very often we come up with terms because we have a sense that there's something real, that there's something here that needs to be named. But sometimes the term that we use is perhaps not the best terms and leads to various confusion. So, for example, I think people came up with the term fundamentalist because you would encounter someone who felt like they had a certain sort of unwillingness to receive, a certain unwillingness to hear, and there was a certain wall. And so there was a sense that there is a qualitative difference. And I think it's also important to realize that most words are created because of a qualitative experience first that you're trying to name to get a grasp on, so that you can better orbit and understand it. And that can therefore help you carry yourself in the world. And I think the term people fell upon for that feeling of hitting a wall was fundamentalists, because very often these people who would hit a wall would appeal to some sort of deepest truth, or I'm just trying to stick with what matters, or I'm just trying to stick with what the Bible says. So there was a certain appeal to the fundamental, right? Well, I think a better term than fundamentalist, because that kind of implies it's possible not to be a fundamentalist. And I think what people are pointing at is you always have to have axioms. It is impossible to actually even organize a philosophy or worldview without, I would say, non-rational axioms that one assents to for, say, experience or faith or whatever, that actually affords the possibility of thinking and rationality. So there's no possibility of thinking without axioms. But the term fundamentalist implies that some people have fundamentals and other people do not, which is a problem. It's more so the case, in my opinion, that the fundamentalist is an enclosurist, I almost want to say. Someone that creates an enclosure around themselves that then blocks out otherness, and they are only willing to meet you if you meet them on the terms. You go through the door that they unlock or keep locked, and they do so to the degree that they think you're not a threat. Right? So there's more of a kind of enclosurist structure that's going on. Also, it should be noted that I don't think anyone intends to be a fundamentalist, quote unquote. No one intends to enclose themselves off to the world, right? They just stumble into it, right? They just find themselves that way. And also, I think they also find themselves incapable of leaving it, because I think most people who we refer to as fundamentalists also feel like if they're not fundamentalists, they're betraying Christianity. They're betraying the church. They're betraying what people believe.
You can see how this very much interacts with this open and closed system. And the irony of someone like Rhett, I think, is that he has become a fundamentalist of a different set of fundamentals. And he would, of course, say, I'm not closed, I'm open. And then he'd say, well, I'm open because of...
That does... I think that if you follow this wholeheartedly, I think it means that, I'm not saying you don't vote, but I think that the idea that the answer is to install Christians into political office, and that's where your hope lies, and to work very tirelessly for that, that's just, it's not biblical. And I think ultimately, I don't think you can hold on to political power and Jesus at the same time. I think that if you're going to hold on to Jesus and you're holding on to this world, you've kind of got to drop that pursuit in the same way. And the crazy thing that happens as a result of this is you end up a lot, like you said, you end up a lot.
Again, the irony is that this guy is the guy who, did he let go of Jesus? Or would he say that he actually, even though maybe he doesn't believe all of the things about Jesus that he used to believe when he was a fundamentalist, that he actually is in much more alignment with the truth that that Jesus manifested in the world. Let's say something like that.
Aligning yourselves with people who do not represent, the fruit of the Spirit. You've got people who are living in fear. I think this is another aspect of this, is that so much of the current political pursuit or pursuit of political power is based in fear. You've got people,
which again just boggles my mind, because I watched the 2024 election, and I heard a lot of fear-based rhetoric from the left too. This might be the last time you ever get a chance to vote. This might be the end of American democracy. This might be the beginning of I'm leaving America. I get these messages about, these scholars on tyrannical systems are leaving America because of what's coming. Oh, it's those darn fundamentalists that provoke fear. Really? Yeah, but also you too.
all across the United States mainlining Fox News and the like every single night. Like, give it to me. Give me that stuff that makes me fearful every single night. I got to be afraid of the brown people who are going to take my jobs, or, you're going
to be afraid of the brown people or afraid of the orange man. Those seems to be the two things on the menu, but they're both in creating these enclosures that, unless not only you have to be as outraged as I am, or I won't let you in. Well, that's kind of an enclosure fundamentalism. Where are we?
And they really don't know how to get outside of the enclosure. Hell is locked from the inside, that old phrase that's used all the time from Lewis, right? So why does that happen? Well, the thing I'll just start with, I guess, and I'll stop. To me, this actually gets at why ideas and like philosophy and all these things are very, very important. Because one of the reasons why is because, like, when I want to read books and I want to think ideas is so that when I encounter someone who's different from me, I don't unintentionally enclose myself because I can't handle that difference, because I've never heard the ideas, or I change in my tone and I get a little bit upset and then they kind of withdraw, right? And to me, the relationship between, say, philosophy and thinkings and personal knowledge is precisely in those moments when you encounter otherness that you're able to maintain hospitality, or not get extremely nervous and fall back into an kind of an enclosure, right? Because I think people are also making the point that you have to believe something, right? Leslie Newbegin, who was a wonderful thinker, he has a lovely book called Proper Confidence, and he says that the choice isn't between certainty and nothing, it's between, you can have confidence, right, without having certainty. And I think that's a very helpful framework. But without ideas and without thinking and without philosophy, then the more radical the otherness you encounter, the more difficult it's going to be to maintain confidence in face of that other person. You start questioning your beliefs, you start questioning what you think. And as a result, you yourself unintentionally begin enclosing and becoming that fundamentalist, right? So one of the things that I think for me that's helpful is that the relationship between ideas and personal knowledge is also tied to, can we ourselves avoid unintentionally becoming enclosurists per se, because we're not ready to encounter otherness? And one of to clarify this, one more point, I want to read about Hinduism, for example, so that when I encounter the Hindu, I can talk with them, because people don't feel like they're heard if the person doesn't reply in a manner that makes them feel like they're heard, right? And if I have no idea anything about Hinduism, the likelihood I'm going to reply to that person in a manner that makes them feel heard is quite low, because I'm probably going to say something stupid or something that's completely off. I'm not going to know Hinduism as well as they do, but the probability of them at least feeling like we're in a conversation, and therefore ideas afford the possibility of intimacy with difference, because ideas are valuable to the degree they afford intimacy ultimately, then knowledge helps me create a field where intimacy becomes possible and I don't unintentionally become an enclosurist, right? And so if we don't do that work, then we can unintentionally become enclosurists, which then we can fall into these pitfalls that I think are being accurately pointed out. More to be said, but that was just coming to mind with the topic.
So
I thought that was a very good. And then Alex is going to respond. Now, you cannot not have a system that you inhabit. You have to inhabit a system. If you don't inhabit a system, you cannot function productively in the world. And the system that you inhabit is going to have some purchase on the system. In some ways, the definition of insanity is someone who has insufficient purchase on the system to actually maintain their own life, or insufficient purchase on a system combined with a degree of power that they are going to end the lives of communities or others in this world. And so you want the I love this one conversation between Grizz and let's see if I can find it. Here it is, early days, Chad in a mask.
Well, I'm a weirdo, so I'm an all or nothing kind of person. So like when I get the idea or the whim that I need to go, it means delete my channel, delete Discord, walk away from all this shit. But at the same time, I'm like, but I can't do it. And so I don't have Facebook at all because I couldn't do like, well, just once in a while check my Facebook. You know.
Oh, so you don't have an involvement sphincter.
No. Nope.
Sphincters are important. Like, let me step into a spiel in case anybody's here for those. Sphincters are very important. If you have a sphincter, you can tighten it and things don't come out so much, or you can loosen it and things come out a whole lot. And one thing they haven't told any of us is that your attention has a sphincter. And if they make you watch 15-second videos over and over, I don't think it's good for your attention sphincter. Oh, that's not the button. That's the button.
That's what my attention sphincter looks like.
It's like a shivering. Help! My attention sphincter is shivering. Help to get into like all the different. I'm curious how many different opponent processes Vervaeke has identified that he talks about as far as the art of the relevance realization engine. Because if it works out to be like 6, and we can stretch it across the lobster monkey manifold on the zodiac axis, that'll be handy.
It's tremendously helpful in life if you can know enough of who you are to have enough of a center that you can actually go back and forth with another. I've started rereading A Severe Mercy, which is an incredible book, and it's a very interesting book. It's a book about a man and a woman who fall in love, and then she dies. And this man was a friend of C.S. Lewis, and so there are letters of his back in there. There's a lot of reflections about life and love, and this gets into, let's say, the Gödel point of the pain and loss and insufficiencies in this world and the will of God. Because, of course, I mean, I've met Christians before who are in a very tight system, and they simply either some suffering blows apart their system, which isn't always the worst thing. Sometimes a worse thing is that they buy into invulnerability and they just have cheap psychological copings that sort of redirect everything. But none of that sort of makes any sense of the eucatastrophe of the crucifixion. And our limitedness and our inabilities really puts us in a place where we have to, like Peter, realize that Satan is going to sift us, that we will fail, that everything may be taken away from us, that we will go in and out of formal systems, and all of our systems need at least the openness sufficient to continue to know truth when we see it, rather than, I liked Peter Lightheart's title of his book, and I didn't read the whole book, but I started reading it, Against Christianity, because he makes the point nicely in the first chapter that you don't really find Christianity in the Bible as such. Hopefully, who do you meet? You meet Jesus. And what does that mean? What does it mean to meet a person instead of a system? Now, again, we're going to have systems. We need systems. Systems are management strategies to deal with combinatorial explosiveness. Without a system, you will simply be overwhelmed and you won't be able to deal with the combinatorial explosiveness that is life in this world. You're going to have to reduce the world. Again, stories are going to be filters for that. Logic systems within stories are going to be filtered for that. But it's helpful to know that finally persons are greater than systems, partly because persons create systems. I think one of the biggest arguments for the existence of God is, in fact, again, the fact that we can make systems that work, and many systems work in this world. These systems are the product of persons, and so it would seem reasonable that the intelligibility question, this gets back to John 1 and the Logos, the intelligibility question is a function of that because the world is intelligible to us, that is, the reason that is so is because we are made in the image of the one who made the world and made it in such a way that it is indeed intelligible, and science can work and all kinds of other systems can work that we create. But we do need a sphincter, and we need to both be solid enough in the systems that we have, but yet flexible and open enough so that we can, in fact, engage and encounter other systems. And I think part of what you see in the stories of Jesus is that capacity. And Jesus doesn't look one of the biggest critiques I'll have with someone like Rhett is that he sort of blew out of one too rigid system to embrace another, because Jesus is part of the reason Jesus continues to be stimulating is because, like the world, there's a combinatorial explosiveness to Jesus himself. So the same man who turns the other cheek turns over the money changers' tables. And he gives a line like, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's. And the more you contemplate that line, it's sort of like a koan, because how do you work through that? And the same man who says, love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy, says, unless you hate your father and mother and brother and sister, you cannot be my disciple. He does all these things. And again, at the point that I've made, people are always like, oh, the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm like, have you read that thing? And I point to, Virginia Owen, Texas A&M English class, 1980s. She hands out the Sermon on the Mount to a bunch of her 1980s students at Texas A&M and has them, well, tell me what you think about this Sermon on the Mount. Most of the people hated it. Christians, although we've been reading that Sermon on the Mount for thousands of years, I can point to a book by a significant Christian New Testament scholar who says there are basically 8 paradigms for just trying to understand the Beatitudes in that. And yet, it's sort of the combinatorial explosiveness of Jesus. And so all of our formal systems must give way. And again, it's the person. The system cannot be above the person. But again, human beings cannot be without systems. You never know what a video is going to be until you make it. This one is this. Leave a comment.